Hey everyone. So, um, before we really dive into things, I want to give a little bit of a introduction or background to um, what I'm doing here. Um, Once in a while, I get asked like, "Oh, how do you really, it's like, how do you look at prospects or how do you identify prospects? How do you know sort of who to look for? What do you look for um, in terms of your process for doing for basically for creating a big board. And obviously everybody has a different process. And I think it's no surprise if you're watching this, you probably know that I kind of lean heavily on stats and analytics, but it's not all stats. And really, the way I use the stats is to identify prospects. I don't just do, I actually I do I do rankings, but I don't in the final um, big board or my final assessment. It's not just going to go by stats. It's going to be a lot more than stats. But where stats can be useful is to basically identify prospects. I don't know. There's like 5,000 D1 players or something like that. Um, you got to sift through just so much data. You can't watch everything. At least I can't. So I have to figure out who to focus on. So I thought it would be interesting to actually take you guys through like sort of a real time um, my real time process, sort of like what I do. If I'm sitting here at my computer and like, oh, who should I be looking at this year or this month, or who are some guys I haven't noticed yet that, if I'm looking to round out my board. So I'm basically going to take you through that. Um, but before I do that, I just want to kind of give a general overview of the process. So, let's think about this as like the statistical identification part of scouting. Now, there's a whole nother, obviously, there's a whole other part of scouting, which is like watching games, um, looking at, you know, um, athleticism, tools, intangibles, everything you can see by, actually watching games. Um, if you can get intel, things like that, which I don't have too much access to, but that kind of stuff. But in my experience, um, it's important to, really the most important thing is to identify who the productive players are. I mean, this is the way I approach it. So basically, my first step is to actually ask the question like, well, how productive are they? And and you know, historically, I found if a player is not productive in college, and well, we have different definitions of productivity, and I'll talk about that in the video, or in the course of this sort of streaming thing. Um, we can all define productivity differently, but it's pretty rare that you have a player who isn't productive in college or anywhere and just goes on to be a an interesting prospect, right? So I kind of start from the place of looking at productivity. Now, other people don't do that. They might start looking at tools or other things. Maybe they look at recruiting rankings and just go by that. I kind of ignore the rankings for the most part. Um, I don't really scout high school, so I don't really know much about players coming in. So for me, the process really starts with what they're doing in college for the most part. And I'm putting Europe and G League to some extent to the side. This is mostly D1. So for me, it all starts with productivity. And really, you could think about there's like three questions here, right? It's like, what did they do? Um, in terms of, did they shoot? Did they rebound? Are they volume scorers? Do they get steals, stocks, all those kinds of things? And then the question is like, how much did they do? Um, Did they play a lot? Did they come off the bench? Um, is the sample size big enough? And this is not just overall, but it could be like, hey, you had a 40% three-point shooter, but they only took 33s, last season. So is that useful? We can talk about that. Um, and then how did they do it, right? So there's, productivity metrics, um, like what I do. If you think, BPM per PR, whatever you want to say about those, you're basically going to weight different stats, right, to come up with one number, and then you're going to look at some ranking. It's some kind of objective measure. Um, so even within that ranking, different players do it different ways, right? So you may have um, some players who are very productive by the definition of a college, um, by their college stats, right? That the productivity is there, but it's productivity in a way that's not going to translate. And so that kind of gets into um, this part down here, which is the context, right? So I start from a place of looking at productivity, but then I take into account the context, and I really discount for a bunch of things, right? Like this is my mental model. So I think about, what is the archetype? Um, are they a 3-and-D wing? Oh, that's nice, right? That's a great archetype. Are they a combo guard, combo scorer? That's tough. Are they a tiny point guard that can't shoot threes? That's a tough archetype, right? Um, are they a super mobile, fast 7-footer that can jump out of the gym? That could be a really interesting archetype, right? Um, and that kind of goes with translation, right? Some of these things, uh, some of the productivity stats translate more easily than others. Now, some might translate, like rebounding. Rebounding tends to translate, but rebounding, we could argue like how important is rebounding, right? So if a player rebounds a lot, that may or may not be that useful at the next level. If that's all they do, probably not going to be a great prospect. There's going to have to be other things. Tools is pretty obvious. Now, tools, it's not really a stats thing, but obviously, you have some of that information at your fingertips, right? So I can like generally want to know like how tall are they, how much do they weigh, if I can, eventually I want to know like what's their wingspan, what's their standing reach, things like that. And the other thing with tools, there are some things you can think about in terms of statistical indicators. Um, I mean, the most obvious one that comes to mind is going to be, for me, is dunks. So that's an athletic indicator. Now, I'll go into this in like probably excruciating detail, but even with something like dunks, um, you can take into account the context of how those dunks are being obtained, right? So much easier for a 7-footer in college to get a lot of dunks than it would be for someone who's like, I don't know, 6'6", 6'7", right? So all else being equal, if the 6'7" guy has the same, rate of dunking that the 7-footer has, obviously one of those is going to be more impressive, right? So you don't just take a number, you have to, look at the context of that number. Um, and other things could be sort of athletic indicators, right? Like things like, hey, this small point guard has a ton of blocks. That's pretty unusual. So, how are they getting those blocks? So things like that could be, they don't necessarily provide all the answers, but they're sort of intriguing um, stats that can, tend to give you some kind of signal about tools, or at least they can. Um, Role. So that's also something that, you know, not necessarily told by the stats. This is probably something you're going to have to do, watch some games, but, college, um, you have a lot of weird lineups and, small players, really small players playing center. And you have to think about things that, what are they actually going to do at the next level, or what are they not doing? So, if you think about the Kentucky guards who are really going to be more like point guards who don't get to show it, um, That's something about their role. So you have to take that into account. Um, Age, I bolded because I think even though some people understand the importance of age, I think I'm one of the sort of 99 percentile in terms of really caring about age, and all else being equal, if I have two prospects and the same with the same productivity and everything like that, if one guy's a year younger, like especially if we're looking at like 18, 19-year olds versus like 20, 21-year olds, that's to me that's a huge advantage to the younger player. Um, and I feel like that's kind of even as much as people talk about it, it's still underrated somewhat. And then another pretty obvious one is the competition level, right? So um, it's easier to be productive if you're in a mid-major, right? Or just playing against weaker competition. So you really have to think about um, the history of the draft, you know, how many players actually come from smaller schools. And to be clear, some do. Um, but you can't think that every guy who puts up great stats at small schools playing against bad competition are going to translate to the NBA. So that's something that it's just you really have to be aware of. And I think thankfully a lot of these guys are it seems like the trend is increasing in terms of transferring to bigger schools where um, they can kind of prove themselves more. So basically, this is a sort of overview of this process, at least the beginning of the process. And yeah, the next thing I'm going to show you guys is basically the rankings that I keep track of. So we're going to look at um, all the freshmen that um, are returning, and yeah, obviously they didn't declare for the draft. And then I'm just going to literally go through a bunch of guys and sort of, um, you know, again, kind of explain my mental process as well as I can in terms of like why a guy intrigues me, which guys I think like don't have a chance, if that's true. Everybody has a chance, but some guys have, if you're being honest, they have less of a chance. So we'll really get into the nitty gritty details in the next part of this.